The teachings of Jesus Christ, encapsulated in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, offer profound insights into the nature and purpose of fasting. Unlike a mere adherence to ritualistic practices, Jesus' guidance on fasting delves into the core of spirituality, emphasizing a profound connection with God that transcends outward displays of piety. In Matthew 6:16-18, as part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus challenges the prevailing norms of publicized fasting, urging a shift towards a more private and authentic expression of devotion. This exploration aims to unravel the truths embedded in Jesus' teachings on fasting, examining the motives, attitudes, and transformative potential that underpin this spiritual discipline. The heart of fasting. Central to Jesus' teachings on fasting is the emphasis on the heart. In Matthew, he admonishes against the ostentatious display of fasting practiced by some, who disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. This critique is not an outright rejection of fasting, but a call to examine the motive behind it. Fasting, Jesus implies, should not be a performance for human applause, but a deeply personal expression of devotion to God. The heart, in biblical language, represents the core of one's being, the seat of emotions, intentions, and desires. Jesus invites his followers to approach fasting with a heart that seeks God sincerely. The act of abstaining from food or certain pleasures, when coupled with a genuine desire to draw closer to God, becomes a powerful spiritual discipline. Private devotion over public display. Continuing in the same passage from the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus recommends a private and discreet approach to fasting. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father, who is unseen. Matthew 6:17-18. This advice is not a prescription for secretiveness, but an encouragement to prioritize the intimacy of one's relationship with God over external recognition. In a world where public acts often garner attention and approval, Jesus redirects the focus inward. True spiritual practices, he suggests, should not be performed with an audience in mind. Instead, the awareness of God's presence becomes the driving force, transforming fasting from a mere physical act into a sacred communion between the individual and the divine. Timing and seasons. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus addresses the question of why his disciples were not fasting, while the disciples of John the Baptist and the Pharisees were. He responds with a metaphor, likening himself to a bridegroom and his disciples to wedding guests. How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. Mark 2:19-20. This metaphorical language introduces the concept of timing and seasons in fasting. Fasting, Jesus acknowledges that there is a time for celebration, joy, and feasting, the presence of the bridegroom symbolizing such a time. However, he also anticipates a future period marked by his absence, during which fasting would become a fitting expression of longing, seeking, and waiting on God. This perspective challenges the notion that fasting is a continuous, unchanging practice. Instead, Jesus recognizes its dynamic nature, suggesting that the appropriateness of fasting may vary according to the season of life. Humility and repentance. The Gospel of Luke deepens our understanding of Jesus' teachings on fasting through the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. In Luke 18:14, Jesus contrasts the self-righteous attitude of a Pharisee who boasts about fasting twice a week with the humble confession of the tax collector. The Pharisee, despite his religious observances, is not justified before God because of his pride. On the other hand, the tax collector, in his humility and acknowledgement of his need for mercy, goes home justified. This parable underscores a crucial element in fasting: humility and repentance. Fasting devoid of a humble posture and genuine repentance loses its spiritual significance. In contemplating Jesus' teachings on fasting, a holistic picture emerges, one that transcends the superficiality of external acts and rituals. Fasting, as Jesus explained, is not a mere physical discipline but a deeply spiritual practice intricately linked to the condition of the heart. The call to private devotion over public display challenges the cultural inclination toward showcasing one's religious acts. The true essence of fasting lies in the intimate connection forged with the unseen Father, where sincerity and authenticity replace the desire for external validation. The acknowledgement of timing and seasons introduces a nuanced understanding of fasting. It's not a ritual to be mindlessly observed, but a dynamic practice that responds to the ebb and flow of life. There are moments of celebration and joy, marked by the presence of the bridegroom, as well as seasons of longing and waiting when fasting becomes a poignant expression of seeking God in the midst of absence. Finally, humility and repentance emerge as non-negotiable components of fasting. The parable in Luke illustrates that a humble heart, recognizing its dependence on God's mercy, is more pleasing to God than the most rigorously observed fast devoid of genuine repentance. As we reflect on Jesus' teachings on fasting, we are invited into a deeper, more meaningful engagement with this spiritual discipline. Fasting becomes not a burden but a pathway to transformation, a journey where the heart, motives, and attitudes align with the sacred purpose of drawing closer to the divine. May these timeless truths resonate in our hearts, guiding us towards a more profound and authentic expression of fasting as a spiritual practice.